Hi everyone, Professor Philip Travis here, and this week, History of Post-War Europe, History 445. This week, we're going to be looking at the social revolutions in Europe in the 1960s. We're going to read from our main text, the Tony Jute book, chapter 12 and 13. There's also an article. The article is about youth movements in the 1960s in Europe, protest, travel, and other types of things in Europe in the 1960s. So be sure to look at that. It's written by the historian's last name is Jobs. So we have not only the Tony Jute reading, but we also have a really good article that I'd like us all to read for the discussion forum for this week. This week we have no major assignments. We've done our paper topic selection. We've taken our midterm exam. And so this week we just have our discussion forum and our readings. Though I want to briefly discuss the paper now that we've gotten past the paper topic selection, the tentative thesis, and basic preliminary research section. I want to talk a little bit about the paper for just a minute. And your midterms, I will get the midterms graded this week, so I'll get to those as promptly as is possible. First, before we talk about our factoid for this week, let me just make a couple of comments on the papers as we move forward. I mean, some of you have had my classes before, and so you really kind of know where you're going with respects to writing these papers. But I'll emphasize, so when you write these papers, and this is important, when you write these papers, first of all, the introduction, what I'm looking for an introduction for a paper like this, what I'd like to see, is I'd like a 2-paragraph introduction. And in that introduction, I would like the first paragraph to be what we would call a narrative hook. Kind of a historical first-hand account drawn from your research that draws the reader in. So, for example, if you were writing about, an aspect of the Cold War, maybe the narrative hook is, a first-hand report of Nikita Khrushchev in a central decision-making process or something, or John F. Kennedy in deliberations with the National Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis, though of course it's a European history class, so you wouldn't be focusing on the United States. But provide a first-hand sort of account to draw the reader in. If you were writing your paper on the social revolutions of the 1960s, you might start with a vivid depiction of the protests that began in Paris, France in the spring of 1968. The students putting up barricades and these types of things in what became a very tumultuous year, the year of 1968. So make the first paragraph of your paper, which again is not due till the end of the term, but this is good stuff to be working on now, especially since there's no other major assignment this week, barring aside from the discussion forum. So a 2-paragraph introduction. The first one, a narrative hook, draw the reader in. The second one is your argument paragraph, where then you explain what is your paper going to demonstrate? What are the questions, what primary questions will your paper answer? Explain to the reader what you're arguing, what the paper will demonstrate, and why this is significant. Do that in the second paragraph, and then in the remainder of the paper, provide your evidence, and then come up with a conclusion, of course. Remember, Chicago-style footnotes is what I'm looking for. There's a guide, a link in the paper guidelines for you if you need to look that up. But you have a free access to a basic sort of guide to Chicago Manual of Style, bibliographical as well as footnote citations. And I do want footnotes just so that everyone knows as opposed to endnotes. And the reason that is because it's much easier for me to grade the paper and see what sources you're using as I grade with footnotes as opposed to endnotes. So please do use footnotes on your paper. And some really, really interesting topics. If you read my feedback and you decide you want to change your topic, you still have time to do that. Though maybe send me an email and run the topic by me quickly before you jump all the way in. Okay, so this week we are looking at the social revolutions of the 1960s. The 1960s was not only a sort of revolutionary period, cultural revolutionary period in the United States, it was also that in Europe. And 1968, for example, in the United States, was obviously a very controversial year associated with protests in Vietnam, over Vietnam, student protests during the Tet Offensive of 1968. But there was also sort of connections to widespread European youth movements in the 1960s as well. And in 1968, it was a similarly tumultuous year, 1968, in Europe, beginning particularly with major demonstrations in Paris, France in 1968. This is also the year of the famed Prague Spring, the widespread protests and uprisings in Prague, the center of today the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, which of course divided. So there's major uprisings in Prague, the Prague Spring, which at the time, of course, was part of the Soviet Union. Major uprisings across Europe, particularly in the May protests of 1968 in Paris, France, and across the Atlantic, huge student uprisings in 1968 as well, protests and so forth. So the 1960s is a period that's really, it really witnesses widespread social unrest, a period of effectively a cultural revolution in Western Europe. And that's the topic of our readings this week and our discussion. Now, for the factoid, this is the factoid. Very interesting. We're going to think about the actual professional discipline of history here. And the factoid of this week relates to a very important historian. And the historian I'm referring to is named E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson. So he wrote a book in the 1960s called The Making of the English Working Class. And if you ever go to grad school for history and you have to take a historiography class, if you go to grad school in history, you will have to take a historiography class. If you take a historiography class, you'll almost always be asked to read The Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson wrote this book in the 1960s, and E.P. Thompson was, so you might call him a Marxist historian, but he was part of a movement called the New Left. And a lot of the cultural sort of revolutions of the 60s were in part driven by the New Left. And the New Left was really made up of liberal activists that had become increasingly disenchanted by what they saw with respects to Soviet communism. So they were really highly critical of the extreme sort of totalitarian and authoritarian regimes of the Soviet Union, and they were very much put off by the gulags, the persecution, the lack of freedom of speech and press and other important freedoms. But they weren't Marxist per se, and they weren't necessarily in favor of like Soviet communism. But the New Left was this sort of leftist movement, largely driven by intellectuals and students across the Atlantic in the United States and Europe during the 1960s. And E.P. Thompson really developed in the 1950s as a key organizer of the New Left. And so in this respect, you will not be reading the book in this class, of course, but if you go to grad school, for example, in history, you'll almost certainly have to read E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. It's a massive, massive book. It's like 900 pages. But it's considered a critical book to understanding the 1960s with respects to historiography, the emergence of the New Left and its influence in historical interpretations. And so it's a really important moment in the historiographical trends in the professional discipline of history. And so E.P. Thompson is kind of a landmark sort of historian during this period, and one of the primary, and this is the factoid right here, E.P. Thompson is not only a landmark historian in the 1960s, but is also one of the principal minds, he was a British historian, one of the principal minds associated with the development of the New Left. And the New Left made up this sort of leftist social movement by individuals, intellectuals, educators, and students, particularly during the 1960s. A movement that was highly critical of the status quo in Western European countries, was also very critical of Soviet-style communism and sort of positioned itself in Europe in the middle between the sort of status quo sort of reform socialist movements in places like Great Britain. It placed itself between that and the far left sort of authoritarianism you found with the Soviet Union. So this week's factoid, one bonus point on a test score at the end of the term. Just send me the factoid before Wednesday by midnight. Get your bonus point. The factoid is E.P. Thompson in the Making of the English Working Class, a really critical moment in the historiography of the professional discipline of history, and also evidence of the New Left during the 1960s.